The book is called Marijuana Legalization, What Everyone Needs to Know. It's published by Oxford University Press. One of the co-authors, editors, is Angela Hawken, who is a public policy professor at Pepperdine University, where we are on location. Angela Hawken, is this book pro or anti-legalization of marijuana?
Neither, and that's what makes it quite unique in the market. It's written by 4 authors, and none of us agree with each other on marijuana legalization. I think that was the genius of Oxford University Press, bringing together 4 different opinions and together figuring out what the true evidence base is. The problem with issues surrounding marijuana is that there are such strong advocacy groups on both sides of the issue that when the public read about it, they have no idea which direction they're being pulled in. So the idea here was to get 4 people who disagree on the issue of legalization to agree on the facts surrounding marijuana.
Where do you stand personally on the issue?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that, but now that you did. In chapter 16 of the book, each of the authors was required to publicly basically declare their position on the subject. And for many of us who are academics, that's a very uncomfortable thing to do because you don't really want to show your hand. In general, when we research, we provide an unbiased, as unbiased as we're able to, set of perspectives. So in this case, we were asked to show our hand. Of the 4 authors, I was the one that was most in favor of marijuana legalization in terms of commercial legalization, which I think was surprising for many because of my Pepperdine affiliation.
Why are you in favor?
Well, as I said as I acknowledged in the chapter, my drug of choice, I'm a cradle Anglican. I had my first drink of wine when I was 13 years old during communion, and I'm a regular consumer and reasonable consumer and safe consumer of wine. So my drug of choice is alcohol. For others, their drug of choice is marijuana. And in terms of social harms, the social harms of alcohol by far dominate the social harms of marijuana. As a policy analyst, I really wanted to see the laws handle the substances more equitably. And it just didn't seem that there was a strong case for being very aggressively anti-marijuana use in the face of very relaxed laws surrounding alcohol, given the risks with alcohol use and the harms associated are so much greater for alcohol than they are for marijuana. Now, a question you didn't ask me, which CNN has done to a number of my colleagues, and as soon as these interviews start, is, well, have you used, are you a user? Now, you're the pro-legalizing one, so clearly you're the marijuana user. And my team have been working with the state of Washington as they've been drafting the state's regulations. And we get asked the question often, well, are you users? Now, who's advising the government? And for a while, the position taken by the team was simply not to answer the question. There's no good way, if you're a researcher, to answer the question, have you used pot or are you a pot user? But I'm willing to tell you right now today that in spite of the fact that I'm the one of the 4 authors who was most in favor of marijuana legalization, I'm not a user. So I really do come to this without a horse in the race. I'm just somebody who's looking at the data and quite concerned by what I've seen.
What's the acceptability of marijuana use in the United States and maybe even just here in California?
Well, it's changed so quickly over time, and I think this is why we're seeing such strong momentum surrounding marijuana too, and also how political rhetoric surrounding marijuana is changing. The latest Pew result that I saw last year, and this would have changed in the meantime, Pew reported findings from summer 2013 looking at where the public is on the issue. And at the moment, at that time, and it would have changed by now, but 58% of Americans were in favor of legalizing marijuana. When you have a majority of the public supporting something like that, politicians have to pay attention. Politicians tend to be rather fickle. What you have noticed is that the language surrounding marijuana use is changing. And California did not pass marijuana legalization when the voters went to the polls in 2010, 2012, I'm forgetting I think it was 2010. It was not passed by a narrow margin. It lost. So the two states that passed since the book was out, we've published that. In fact, we planned the release date just surrounding the time of the voters going to the voting polls. And we were surprised. My co-authors thought that, weren't sure that a state would tip. I predicted that we'd have at least 1, possibly 2 states tip, and we did. We saw Washington and Colorado move in the direction of legalization.
When's it going to be on the ballot again in California?
You know, I believe that the real big advocacy players are looking to California for 2016. And in fact, for a few years now, it's been the chatter that big push for marijuana in California would be 2016, that they somehow thought that would be the important election year. I'd be surprised if other states don't move in the meantime. I'd be surprised if a few states don't move in 2014, so that California will be a laggard state in that regard.
Who smokes marijuana in the United States?
A stunning number of people smoke marijuana. Globally, the prevalence of marijuana use is about 3 to 4%.
3 to 4%.
3 to 4%
globally.
Globally, Americans have a much more aggressive taste for marijuana than that. We're running at about 3 times the global prevalence.
So about 10%.
10-12% of Americans. So in the last year, 30 million Americans smoke marijuana. Now, most of them, about a third of those, would have been people who would be called the experimenters, somebody who will, really think of it as being something quite radical. They have a drag, they've smoked a little bit of pot, and wouldn't smoke again in the year. So about a third of that is for people who really are the unusual experimenters. It's not a way of life for them. And then we have a relatively sizable share of that population who are social smokers. They will smoke once in a while because they're with a group of peers who are smoking. It's really not a way of life. But then there is a group of people, about 20% of marijuana users, for whom this is really a way of life. They smoke every day or every couple of days, and some of them, of course, will go on to have an issue with abuse or dependency. Now, marijuana is a little different from some of the other illegal drugs in terms of abuse and dependency. So if you look at people who are regular consumers of marijuana, so for example, the people who use every 2 days or more often, so daily users or every 2 days, about a third of marijuana users who use that much meet clinical criteria for abuse or dependency. If you compare it with a drug like cocaine, for example, 88% meet clinical criteria for abuse or dependency. So the typical heavy user of cocaine is dependent on cocaine. The typical heavy user of marijuana is not dependent on marijuana, which I think really does differentiate marijuana from some of the other illicit drugs in an important way.
How does that compare to alcohol abuse or use?
In some ways, alcohol and marijuana, in terms of use and abuse, are relatively similar. It would be a similar share. Many people use alcohol every day or every few days, and I'd fall into that. Every couple of days, I'm going to have a glass of wine. I don't meet any clinical criteria for abuse or dependency. So those ratios look relatively similar for marijuana and alcohol. In terms of how many people are going to go on to have really problem use. That's not to say that problem marijuana use is a trivial issue. Some people really do meet clinical criteria for dependency and abuse whose lives are in disarray. They're unproductive, they're not able to get things done, they self-disclose as having tried to quit and not managed to quit. So the people who do meet those clinical criteria, even though they're a minority, have very serious issues in trying to move on to a life that doesn't include the use of the substance.
Angela Hawken, what's with the medical marijuana laws, is that a way around legalization and punishment?
It does. It varies very much depending on the state that you're in. In California, it's essentially, if you went to Venice Beach, is notorious for this just down the road here. If you went to Venice Beach and you could look at a long list of ailments, they'll tell you what to complain about and you'll leave with a recommendation in a few minutes. So essentially, it's become a very easy environment in which to obtain essentially legal access to marijuana. But the legalization of marijuana in terms of commercial legalization is very different from medical marijuana in that it really allows the commercial production and sale of marijuana for non-medical use, for recreational use. In the book, I describe medical marijuana in some detail. My concerns about medical marijuana, according to the California model, where really they've put where these doctors have really made a farce of medical marijuana. There are some people who have serious medical issues that are turning to marijuana for relief. They turn out to be a tiny, tiny percentage of the total number of medical marijuana carrying users. About 5% have what we would consider a diagnosable reason for carrying a medical marijuana card, 1 in 20. The rest are probably people who enjoy using marijuana. Everybody kind of knows that, and it's done with a wink and a wink. Now, as I said, I'm in favor of outright legalization, so I have no reason to be really unhappy about that, except that I don't like that somebody who is willing to lie to a doctor and obtain a card has no problem when interacting with the law, whereas someone who doesn't want to make those sorts of false statements does. I think it creates a really uncomfortable system. So I have some real concerns about how medical marijuana has played out in some states. Obviously, other states have a tighter operation than California does, but right here we've had some serious challenges.
What kind of tax revenues has California garnered from medical marijuana, and what are the early results from Colorado?
Well, Colorado has been, it's been fascinating to watch, and just in the last few months we've seen taxation results released.